The HR manager's voice was steady, but her eyes held something I'd never seen before, pity mixed with pure disgust. "We need to show you something," she said, sliding a tablet across the mahogany conference table. As the audio began playing, I watched my best friend's face drain of every drop of color, like someone had pulled a plug and let her soul leak out onto the floor. But let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because the betrayal was so much deeper and more calculated than I ever imagined. 3 months earlier, I was riding the highest wave of my career. At 28, I'd finally landed an interview at Morrison & Associates, the top marketing firm in Chicago, the kind of place where junior executives drove BMWs and senior partners owned lake houses in Michigan. This wasn't just any job. This was the job. Senior Creative Director. 6-figure salary. The position I'd been obsessing over since college. I'd been grinding at a mid-tier agency for 5 years, watching my ideas get watered down by clients who thought Comic Sans was fun and approachable. This interview was my escape hatch from mediocrity. But I had no idea that my closest friend was already planning to climb through that same hatch, using my own hands as a ladder. I'm Casey, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes your closest friends are your most dangerous enemies. When I told Meredith about the interview, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for. We were sitting in our usual booth at Café Luna, the little coffee shop where we'd been meeting every Tuesday for 4 years since college. Her green eyes lit up like Christmas morning. She grabbed my hands across the sticky wooden table, nearly knocking over her oat milk latte in pure excitement. "Oh my God, Casey. This is it. This is your moment." The genuine joy in her voice made my chest warm. Having someone believe in your dreams feels like being wrapped in the world's softest blanket. But what I didn't notice was the split second where her smile faltered, like a mask slipping before she quickly adjusted it back into place. That micro-expression should have been my first warning sign. Meredith immediately positioned herself as my interview coach, my strategic advisor, my personal cheerleader rolled into one perfectly assembled package. "I'm clearing my entire schedule to help you," she announced, already pulling out her phone. "We're going to make you absolutely irresistible to them." As a fellow marketing professional, she worked at a smaller boutique agency across town. She understood the industry inside and out. Her analytical mind had always complemented my creative instincts perfectly. What I didn't understand was that she was conducting the most thorough competitive analysis of her career, with me as the competition. She was studying me like I was a business case to be solved. For 3 weeks, Meredith became my shadow. She arrived at my apartment every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, armed with research folders, practice questions, and an energy that made me feel like I was training for the Olympics. We dissected Morrison & Associates like surgeons. She helped me analyze their recent campaigns, identify their brand voice, understand their client roster down to the last detail. She researched each interviewer on LinkedIn, finding connection points and conversation starters. "Tell me about their sustainability campaign for green tech." She'd drill me relentlessly while I practiced my presentation stance in my living room mirror. "What would you have done differently?" I'd explain my ideas while she took notes in her neat, precise handwriting. Page after page of my thoughts, my strategies, my creative approaches to their biggest challenges. What I didn't know was that she was also working late into the night, secretly submitting her own application using everything I'd shared. Every insight I shared was like handing her ammunition for a war I didn't know we were fighting. The night before my interview, Meredith insisted on a full dress rehearsal. She'd even bought a small camera to record me, claiming it would help me see my nervous habits. I stood in my best blazer in front of my bathroom mirror, practicing my opening statement while she filmed from the doorway. "Tell me why you want this position," she said, playing the role of interviewer with Academy Award-level commitment. I launched into my prepared response, talking about creative vision and strategic thinking, about wanting to push boundaries and create campaigns that actually mattered. My voice carried the passion of someone who'd been dreaming about this moment for years. What I couldn't see was the way she was studying me like a scientist observing a lab rat, memorizing not just my words but my gestures, my inflection, my soul. The morning of my interview, I woke up with my stomach doing gymnastics routines I didn't know were possible. Meredith was already in my kitchen, making coffee and toast like she lived there. "You're going to be absolutely amazing," she said, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like vanilla perfume and what I thought was genuine affection. "They'd be crazy not to hire you." She drove me to the Morrison Building, a gleaming glass tower that reflected the morning sun like a beacon of possibility. As I got out of her car, she rolled down the window. "Remember everything we practiced. You've got this, babe." I walked into that building carrying 3 weeks of preparation and the warm glow of unconditional friendship, not knowing that both were about to be weaponized against me. The interview went better than I'd dared to hope. The conference room overlooked Lake Michigan, and the afternoon sun painted everything in golden light that felt like a good omen. Margaret Chen, the head of creative, nodded approvingly as I presented my portfolio. When I pitched my idea for their struggling retail client, a campaign about authenticity in an artificial world, I saw something click in her eyes. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need here," she said, making notes on her tablet. I walked out of that building feeling like I was floating 6 inches off the sidewalk. When Meredith picked me up, I was practically vibrating with excitement. "It was perfect," I told her as we drove through downtown traffic. "I think I actually have a real shot at this." But while I was celebrating what felt like the interview of my life, Meredith was already planning her next move. The next morning, I was still riding my interview high when my phone rang. Margaret Chen's name appeared on the screen, and my heart started drumming like a hummingbird's wings. This was it. The call that would change my life. "Hi, Casey." Margaret's voice sounded different than it had during the interview. Cooler, more distant. "I'm calling because we've made a decision about the senior creative director position." I held my breath, already imagining myself walking into that glass tower as an employee instead of a hopeful candidate. "We've decided to go with another candidate. Someone whose vision more closely aligns with our current strategic direction." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs and the hope from my chest. I spent the rest of that day in my pajamas, alternating between crying into ice cream and replaying every moment of the interview, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. When Meredith came over that evening, she found me curled on my couch like a defeated animal. "I'm so sorry, babe," she said, settling beside me with the same vanilla perfume that had comforted me that morning. "Their loss, honestly. You're too good for them anyway." But something in her voice felt hollow, like she was reading lines from a script instead of speaking from her heart. I was too devastated to notice that her sympathy felt more like performance art than genuine emotion. 2 weeks later, the knife twisted deeper when I saw Meredith's LinkedIn update. "Thrilled to announce I'm joining Morrison and Associates as their new senior creative director." My phone nearly slipped from my hands. The betrayal hit me in waves. First confusion, then disbelief, then a rage so pure it made my vision blur. She'd applied for the same position, while helping me prepare, while pretending to be my biggest supporter. I called her immediately, my fingers shaking as I dialed. "Casey, hi." Her voice was bright, cheerful, completely unaware that I'd seen her post. "What's up?" "You got the Morrison job," I said, my voice flat as roadkill. The pause that followed felt like falling down an elevator shaft.
"Oh, that.
"Yeah, I was going to tell you."
When?"
"After you started working there." Her explanation was a masterpiece of manipulation wrapped in concerned trolling and false empathy. "I only applied because I knew you were heartbroken about not getting it," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use when they're lying to your face. "I thought maybe if I was there, I could help create opportunities for you later." The audacity was breathtaking. She was trying to frame her betrayal as an act of friendship. "You used my research," I said, each word sharp enough to cut glass. "My strategies. My ideas." "Casey, come on. We're both marketing professionals. Of course there's going to be some overlap." I hung up. I couldn't listen to another second of her gaslighting. But as I sat there in my apartment, surrounded by the remnants of my broken dreams, I had no idea that karma was already sharpening its blade. For 3 days, I wallowed in a depression so thick I could practically taste it. I called in sick to my current job, ordered takeout that I barely touched, and considered whether it was possible to die from disappointment. On the fourth day, my phone rang. Margaret Chen's name appeared on the screen again. My first instinct was to decline the call. I couldn't handle another rejection, another explanation of why I wasn't good enough. But something made me answer. Casey, this is Margaret. I need you to come in immediately. We need to show you something. Margaret's voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, serious, almost grim. Like a detective who just uncovered evidence in a murder case. I can't discuss this over the phone, she continued. But I think you deserve to know what really happened with your interview. Can you be here in an hour? My mind raced through possibilities. Had they made a mistake? Found new information? Discovered something about Meredith? Of course, I said, already reaching for my keys. The drive to Morrison and Associates felt surreal, like traveling through a dream where familiar landmarks had been rearranged. The same glass tower that had once represented hope now felt ominous, like walking toward a courtroom where my fate would be decided. But I had no idea that I wasn't walking toward judgment. I was walking toward vindication. Margaret met me in the lobby personally, which struck me as unusual. Her expression was unreadable, professional, but carrying an undercurrent of barely contained anger. We rode the elevator to the 14th floor in silence. The numbers climbing felt like a countdown to something momentous. She led me to a conference room I hadn't seen during my interview, smaller, more intimate, with a view of the city that made me feel like I was floating above the world. Please sit, she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. On the table between us sat a tablet and a manila folder thick with documents. Before we begin, I want you to know that what you're about to hear may be deeply upsetting. But you deserve to know the truth. Margaret opened the folder, revealing what looked like interview transcripts and evaluation forms. Her fingers drummed once against the table before she spoke. During our hiring process, we record all final round interviews for training and evaluation purposes. It's standard procedure, disclosed in our hiring materials. I nodded, remembering signing something about recording during my paperwork. 3 days after Meredith started, she pitched that exact same authenticity in an artificial world concept to our biggest client. When I reviewed her presentation, I felt déjà vu, like I'd heard those exact words before. That's when I went back to compare both interview recordings. The word compare made my stomach drop. She slid the tablet toward me. What I discovered was disturbing. I think you need to hear this. The audio quality was crystal clear, professional-grade equipment capturing every nuance of sound. I heard Margaret's voice asking the same questions she'd asked me, the same warm tone I remembered. Then I heard Meredith's response. But it wasn't her voice that made my blood turn to ice. It was her words. She was repeating, almost verbatim, the answers I'd practiced with her for weeks. The same examples, the same strategic approaches, even the same jokes I'd planned to use to build rapport. Even the exact same unusual industry reference I'd made up, a fictional campaign name that didn't exist anywhere online. It was like listening to a ghost of myself, spoken through someone else's mouth. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how confident she sounded, how smoothly she delivered my ideas as if they'd sprung fully formed from her own brilliant mind. She hadn't just stolen my preparation, she'd stolen my voice, my creativity, my professional identity. That campaign concept about authenticity in an artificial world, Margaret said quietly, pausing the recording. Not only did she present it as her own original concept in the interview, but she pitched the exact same idea, with your same unusual phrasing and strategic framework, to our retail client 3 days into her job. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. That's when I knew something was wrong. The concept was too distinctive, too specifically crafted to be coincidence. So, I pulled her interview recording and compared them side by side. What I found was systematic intellectual theft. Margaret's voice carried a disgust that matched the nausea rising in my stomach. But there's more. She fast-forwarded through the recording, stopping at a section near the end of the interview. This is the part that made us realize you weren't just a coincidence. You were the victim. What I heard next made me understand why Margaret had called this meeting, why she'd looked at me with such intensity in the lobby. It was Margaret's voice asking, "Do you have any concerns about working with other creative professionals in the area? Chicago's marketing community can be quite close-knit." Then Meredith's laugh, that tinkling sound I'd heard thousands of times during our friendship. "Oh, you mean like Casey Morrison? Actually, I should probably mention that she interviewed here too. Poor thing, she's been struggling professionally for a while. I tried to help her prepare, but honestly, she just doesn't have the strategic thinking for a role like this. She's more of a basic creative type, you know?" The betrayal in that moment felt like being stabbed in the back while someone smiled at your face. My hands were shaking as the full scope of her betrayal unfolded before me. She hadn't just stolen my ideas, she'd actively tried to sabotage my professional reputation. She called me basic, I whispered, the word tasting like poison in my mouth. "She also implied you were emotionally unstable and difficult to work with," Margaret added, her voice tight with anger. "She suggested that hiring you would be a mistake because you don't handle rejection well." The cruelty was breathtaking. For weeks, she'd positioned herself as my greatest advocate while secretly orchestrating my professional assassination. But as I sat there absorbing the magnitude of her betrayal, I realized something that made me sit up straighter. Margaret wasn't showing me this to hurt me, she was showing me this to make it right. "Obviously, we can't hire someone who built their entire candidacy on stolen material and character assassination," Margaret continued. "We've terminated Meredith's employment, effective immediately." The words washed over me like cool water on a burn. "But more importantly, we owe you an enormous apology. Your interview was genuine, creative, and impressive. You earned this position fair and square, and we'd like to offer it to you now, if you're still interested." My brain struggled to process what she was saying. The job was mine. The position I'd dreamed about, worked for, been betrayed for. It was actually mine. "There's just one more thing we need to discuss." Margaret pulled out another folder, this one containing legal documents. "We take intellectual property theft very seriously here. Meredith signed confidentiality agreements when she started, which she violated by using your proprietary creative concepts. We're pursuing legal action." She slid a paper toward me. "We'd also like you to consider whether you want to press charges for corporate espionage." What she did, systematically gathering your strategic insights under false pretenses, it's not just unethical, it's criminal. The power dynamic had completely flipped, and I was holding all the cards. The next few hours felt like being caught in a whirlwind of justice and vindication. Margaret introduced me to the team as their new senior creative director, explaining that there had been irregularities with their previous hire. My new colleagues were welcoming, professional, and completely unaware of the drama that had led to my arrival. As far as they knew, I was simply the right person for the job, which it turned out I always had been. That evening, I sat in my apartment, the same space where I'd cried over ice cream just days before, drafting my resignation letter to my old job. The contrast was surreal, from devastation to triumph in less than a week. But the sweetest moment was still to come. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Please." I knew it was Meredith. She'd probably been fired that afternoon, escorted from the building with her belongings in a cardboard box like something out of a movie. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her stew in the consequences of her actions. But a larger part of me, the part that had been betrayed, lied to, and professionally sabotaged, needed to hear what she had to say for herself. I texted back, "Cafe Luna, 1 hour." It was time for the final confrontation. She was already there when I arrived, hunched in our usual booth like a wilted flower. Her perfect makeup was smudged, her designer blazer wrinkled, her confidence completely deflated. When she looked up at me, her eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "Casey, please let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you called me basic to my future employer. How you tried to destroy my reputation while pretending to be my friend." She flinched like I'd slapped her. "I never meant for it to go this far. I wanted the job so badly, and when I saw how prepared you were, I panicked." Her explanation was a cascade of self-pity and justification that made my stomach turn. She talked about feeling overlooked at her current job, about financial pressure, about how seeing my success made her realize how far behind she was falling. I thought maybe if I just used some of your ideas, I could level the playing field, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. I never meant to hurt you. You recorded me practicing. You took notes on my strategies. You called me emotionally unstable to potential employers. That's not panic. That's premeditated sabotage. She had no response to that. The worst part, I continued, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, is that you made me doubt myself. You made me think I failed when I'd actually succeeded. The look on her face told me she finally understood the full scope of what she'd done. I'm going to lose everything, she whispered. Morrison was going to be my big break. And now they're talking about legal action and other companies will hear about this. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy that had defined our friendship. But then I remembered her voice on that recording, dismissing me as basic, questioning my competence, systematically dismantling my reputation. You made your choice when you decided to build your success on my failure. The consequences are just the natural result of that choice. I stood up to leave. Casey, please. Our friendship has to count for something. I paused at the edge of our booth, the same spot where she'd celebrated my opportunity just weeks before. We were never friends. Friends don't do what you did. Walking out of that coffee shop felt like shedding an old skin. The late afternoon sun painted the sidewalk golden, and for the first time in weeks, the world felt full of possibility instead of betrayal. My phone buzzed with messages from other friends who'd heard about my new job, genuine congratulations from people who celebrated my success without trying to steal it for themselves. This was what real friendship looked like. 6 months later, I'm thriving in my dream job at Morrison and Associates. The campaign I developed for their struggling retail client, that authenticity in an artificial world concept, won a regional advertising award. Margaret framed the award certificate and hung it in the conference room where she first showed me that recording. Sometimes I catch her looking at it with satisfaction, like a detective who solved a particularly satisfying case. Meredith's career in marketing effectively ended that day. Word travels fast in Chicago's professional circles, and intellectual property theft isn't something the industry forgives. Last I heard, she'd moved back to her hometown in Ohio to work for her father's insurance agency. The legal case was settled out of court, with Morrison and Associates receiving significant damages for the stolen intellectual property. They donated the money to a scholarship fund for young women in marketing, a detail that made the justice feel even sweeter. But the real victory wasn't professional success or legal vindication. The real victory was learning to trust my own worth, to recognize genuine support for manipulation, and to understand that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones willing to sacrifice us for their own advancement. I still meet friends for coffee, but now I choose them more carefully. And I never, ever share my interview prep with anyone. Because the best revenge isn't destroying your betrayer, it's building something so successful that their sabotage becomes just a footnote in your triumph.